So I guess a starting point is, why am I starting with a picture of electricity when we're talking about the internet and open internet? And I think, I guess, the way that we think about this issue in terms of the internet and in terms of where we need to go with the internet to enable social entrepreneurs in Chicago and in the United States is that we need to do for the internet what we did for electricity. That we created electricity to the degree to which it was abundant, and that we could essentially waste electricity, use that as a basis for innovation, and take that electricity and create all kinds of new apps using it, like radio, television, allowing people to farm in different ways. And we feel really strongly in Chicago that where we need to go with the internet is we need to make the internet like electricity, like a utility in the same way that it has been before. Just a couple of quotes that signify, I think, where the United States thinking is going about broadband and the internet, that we see electricity, we see the internet much as we saw electricity, as we saw water, sewer, gas a century ago, as being essential infrastructure for enabling entrepreneurs, not just something that is an indication of inclusion, of progress, but something that is an enabler of it. And we feel, and I think many of the folks in the room as well, share the view that creating abundant broadband, creating abundant bandwidth throughout the world is the greatest infrastructure challenge that our generation faces. That much as our grandparents, our great-grandparents sought to create a world in which we had electricity, in which we had the resources, the roads that we need, that the internet and the abundance of the internet is our great challenge. So I want to talk about very briefly 4 opportunities for social entrepreneurs that we see in a world in which there is abundant broadband. So the first is really to look at ways in which we can drive universal adoption of broadband. The second is to look at developing killer applications, many of which Will talked about, and to use the internet for new ways of working and to also mitigate the unintended consequences. So this is probably something that many of you have seen. It's not really the feel-good chart of the year for everyone here. I think what this communicates is that although we are making significant progress, this is 2008, we've made progress in the past 2 years, that there remain large gaps between people that are connected and that are not connected. And that even in highly industrialized countries, that we still have issues in terms of reaching large segments of our population with the internet. So this is something that can be viewed as a liability, as a problem. We can say, this is something that we need to fix, and this is a deficit. But I actually think, in the context of social entrepreneurship and the people in this room, that this could be potentially a huge opportunity. Because what this tells me, at least, is that there's a huge unserved market here. That the existing providers or the existing folks that are in the market are, for whatever reason, not able to connect with some segment of the population and reach them. And what that means, at least in the United States, is that that creates an opportunity for entrepreneurs with a social purpose to come in and find ways of serving those people. So we can imagine scenarios in which we have startup companies that are internet service providers focused on, in the United States, for example, African-American populations that are traditionally disconnected, or people who speak Spanish who are less likely to be online. And this creates an opportunity for social entrepreneurs. This slide gives me a little bit of trouble because when I showed this slide to some doctors, they said using the term killer apps is not something that you want to use in a healthcare context. But I think the fact remains that this abundant and broadband, in the same way that we had electricity decades ago, that there's an opportunity to create killer apps that really improve people's lives dramatically in ways that we couldn't even see before. These are, in our work in Chicago, 6 verticals that we're focusing on that we think are potentially the highest impact. And we're working on building partnerships around exploring how can we use very high bandwidth fiber optics, 1 gigabit per second, 10 gigabits per second, to transform the way that these things work in our city and in our country. And I think that this will create huge opportunities for social entrepreneurs to harness the power of this advanced internet. But even in addition to creating apps, that there are ways in which social entrepreneurs that are out there working today to help people can use these changes to just work better. that we're seeing increasingly nonprofit organizations, startup organizations using the internet, using social media as ways of actually reaching donors, reaching funders, but also using those as delivery channels to reach customers. So for social entrepreneurs, you don't just have to be in technology. You can be someone that's working to achieve a social goal and leverage technology to advance the work that you're already doing. And then the last major opportunity that I think is out there for social entrepreneurs that we haven't explored as much as we probably should is the idea of mitigating unintended consequences. So I mentioned earlier that electricity had become abundant and that it was almost free. And the truth is that electricity is not free, that there are consequences in terms of electricity consumption, in terms of energy consumption that we're only now seeing with climate change and global warming. So I think it would be naive to think that we're not going to see similar unintended consequences as we move towards a world in which we have abundant bandwidth. And that will create, much as we see now with the clean energy sector, with entrepreneurs that are focused around mitigating climate change, mitigating potentially adverse effects of the internet revolution will actually create opportunity spaces for entrepreneurs. I'm just going to talk really briefly about a couple policy areas that are emerging as important. This doesn't mean that the city of Chicago officially has a stand on any of these areas, but this is just to say that these are the things that are emerging as part of the policy discussion in Washington, D.C., in our cities in the U.S., and increasingly globally. So number one, when we think about universal adoption, the question comes up of open access and of really saying what are the requirements that we place on the telecommunications industry to ensure that we have robust competition and sharing of infrastructure. And this is emerging as a very hot topic in the United States. The other issue that we're looking at is infrastructure coordination. And we know that, for example, 80% of the cost in deploying fiber optics comes from actually digging the ground. How can we find better ways of doing that? I would say on the application side, responsible network management, which is a pleasant euphemism for net neutrality, is to say, you know, how can we have applications being developed by social entrepreneurs if they have to pay telecommunications companies to get prioritized in terms of speed and in terms of access to customers? That creates real challenges. And also, what are the funding pools that are out there? So we're seeing in the United States that foundations are increasingly using a tool called program-related investments, where they're actually investing in for-profit companies that deliver a below-market return as a way of encouraging entrepreneurial growth. And then as we look at new ways of working, obviously thinking about how do we incorporate technology into different grant programs, and how do we as the public sector redesign the way that we interact with residents in the digital age. The last thing that I think we're seeing is an increasing focus on designing and thinking about vulnerable populations like people with disabilities, and also the implications for cybersecurity, for privacy, for consumer protection of the internet. So I'll just close by talking very briefly about a few of the things that we're doing in Chicago along these lines. We have roughly 3 areas that our Digital Excellence Initiative works in. The first is infrastructure, so we focus a lot on long-term planning in terms of where Chicago needs to be for infrastructure, looking at building out community Wi-Fi networks, and also a lot of advocacy for state and federal policies. One of the things that Fleur mentioned was the focus of the Obama administration on the internet, which we haven't seen in a long time. And we played a really active role in the shaping of our national broadband plan, which was released in February. The second point is looking at adoption. We just launched what we call a Smart Communities program, which is in 5 digitally underserved neighborhoods, to look at how can we get internet adoption rates that are as low as 35% and get them up to 50, 60, 70%, and use them as platforms for testing some of these ideas that Will is talking about. And then the last is really on the application side. We're looking at building what we call a Smart Chicago Collaborative that will bring together academics, the private sector, and researchers from across the board to explore the potential of new bandwidth. So with that, I'll stop because I'm sharing over time, but hopefully this raises some of the things that we're doing in the U.S.
Thank you, Mark.